Vonnie agreed to cooperate with the feds and testify against Lil Durk, but Durk's team just flipped the entire story on him, accusing Vonnie of being the real mastermind behind the murder-for-hire plot. And Vonnie's response to being blamed for everything is getting attention. Let me break it down. The trial that everyone had been waiting almost 2 years for finally started, and it didn't waste any time getting ugly. The trial began on August 20, 2026, in a federal courtroom in Los Angeles, and within the first day, the entire narrative around who was responsible for a young man's death got turned on its head. Here's the setup. Durk Banks, the Chicago rapper known as Lil Durk, sat at the defense table facing charges that could put him away for life. A conviction on the most serious counts carries a possible life sentence. Sitting across from him, metaphorically at least, was Kayvon Grant, known to the streets and to OTF as Vonnie. Grant wasn't in the courtroom as a defendant that day. He was there in spirit as the man the prosecution was leaning on hardest and the man the defense was about to try to bury. Prosecutors opened first. Assistant U.S. Attorney Daniel Weiner told the jury a story about revenge. He said this is a case about revenge, stalking, and premeditated murder, and told the jurors that Grant already pleaded guilty in the case and would testify against Banks. Weiner wasn't shy about naming names either. He said 2 other alleged co-conspirators also took plea deals and were cooperating, identifying the men as Casey OTF Jam Hester and Keith Jones, identified as one of the shooters outside the Beverly Center. For dramatic effect, the prosecutor put up a single word on a screen in front of the jury: revenge. Weiner showed jurors surveillance video of the Brazen Daylight shooting and put a blue title card up on the screens along with the single word revenge. He laid out how Banks and his 2 co-defendants at trial, DeAndre Wilson and David Lindsay, separately traveled to Los Angeles along with other men involved in the shooting to hunt and kill Quando Rondo, fatally striking Robinson instead. Then Durk's lawyer got up, and this is where the story stopped being simple. Marissa Goldberg, representing Banks, didn't just deny her client's involvement. She went after Vonnie directly, and she went hard. She said Kayvon Grant was initially identified by authorities as the one in charge of the deadly shooting, and that when authorities busted down Grant's door in October 2024, he realized his only way out of jail was to minimize his own involvement and give them someone bigger. Goldberg told the jury exactly what she believed happened in Grant's head that day. They were pressing him about a big fish, and he thought, "Oh man, I've got an insurance policy." Goldberg told jurors that line, an insurance policy, wasn't about money. It was about Grant using Durk as a way out. Goldberg then went into the specifics of how Grant allegedly built his cooperation. She said Grant, who worked for Banks at his music management company, Astronaut Sounds, had access to a company credit card and told investigators that he had booked travel for the group of alleged hitmen at Banks's direction, and Goldberg said that account was false. Then came the line that basically summed up the entire defense strategy in one breath. Mr. Banks had nothing to do with it. He was not there. He had nothing to do with it, she told the jury. So here's where things stood after opening statements. The man who snitched, the man who pleaded guilty and agreed to testify against his former boss, was suddenly being accused in a federal courtroom of being the actual leader of the plot. Vonnie went from cooperating witness to co-defendant's target in the span of one opening statement. And it didn't stop with the credit card story. Goldberg's team took it further, going back to the day King Von died. Goldberg said the real mastermind of the plot was Vonnie, who had been best friends with Von since birth, and had been the one to drive the rapper to the hospital in 2020, while he bled out in his back seat. That's not a small detail to drop in a courtroom. That's putting Vonnie in the car, at the scene on the night everything started. Other reporting from inside the courtroom backed up how far the defense was willing to go. According to a court reporter following the trial, Lil Durk's defense responded to the prosecution's opening arguments with accusations of their own, putting the blame solely on OTF Vonnie, saying Vonnie was present for King Von's death and that Von had even told him, "Why did you let me get shot?" Read that again. Durk's team is telling a federal jury that King Von, in his final moments, turned to Vonnie, his childhood best friend, and asked why he let it happen. That's not a legal argument anymore. That's an accusation of betrayal, layered on top of a murder trial, layered on top of a cooperation deal. 3 different kinds of snitching all tangled into one story, and Vonnie is now sitting at the center of every single one of them. To understand why this hits as hard as it does, you have to go back, way back, before the trial, before the arrests, before any of the plea deals, because Vonnie wasn't just some name attached to a case number. He was as close to Durk and as close to King Von as anybody in that circle ever got. Before he was a name read out in a federal indictment, Kevon Grant was just Vonnie, a guy from the same Chicago streets that produced King Von and Lil Durk, riding with only the family from close to the beginning. OTF wasn't just a record label. According to the superseding indictment, in 2010, Banks formed an organization called Only the Family, which, among other things, produced and sold hip-hop music from artists primarily from the Chicago area, and also acted as an association in fact of individuals who engaged in violence, including murder and assault at Banks' direction and to maintain their status in OTF. Vonnie wasn't a background player in that world. He worked directly for Durk. Not as an artist, not as a hanger-on, but as personal staff. Banks' attorney Marissa Goldberg shifted the blame for the murder plot on co-defendant Kevon Grant, the Chicago rapper's personal assistant, who pleaded guilty to murder and agreed to cooperate with the government against Durk. Prosecutors described his position in even blunter terms during their own opening. They also have 3 cooperating witnesses who've pled guilty and will testify against Durk. 2 of the shooters, Casey OTF Jam and Keith Flacka Jones, as well as Kevon Vonnie Grant, who prosecutors say was Durk's right-hand man and who procured stolen cars and guns for the crime. Right-hand man. That's the label the government put on him, and it's not a small one. This wasn't some kid on the outer edge of the group who got swept up in a raid. This was someone Durk trusted enough to run errands through his own company. Someone with access to the credit card, someone in the room. Then there's the other side of Vonnie's story. The side that has nothing to do with Durk directly and everything to do with King Von. Von and Vonnie weren't just label mates. According to the defense's own account in court, Vonnie had been best friends with Von since birth and had been the one to drive the rapper to the hospital in 2020 while he bled out in his back seat. That's the kind of detail that sticks with a jury. It's also the kind of detail that makes the entire case feel less like a business dispute and more like a fracture inside a family that started years before any federal agent ever got involved. King Von was shot in November 2020, and the story of what happened that night has followed OTF ever since. Von wasn't just a member of the label, he was one of its brightest stars, someone whose death immediately became the emotional center of gravity for everything that came after. Fans, other rappers, internet commentators, everybody wanted to know who was responsible, who could have stopped it, who was really there. Vonnie's name kept surfacing in those conversations long before any indictment came down, because he was the one who'd been physically present, the one in the car, the one who watched it happen up close. Fast forward almost 4 years, and that same closeness is exactly what put Vonnie in a federal interrogation room. When agents came for him in October 2024, they weren't coming for a stranger to the case. They were coming for someone who'd been inside the operation the whole time, someone who allegedly knew where the money moved, who booked the travel, who had access to guns and cars. That's the raid Durk's lawyer described to the jury. When authorities busted down Grant's door in October 2024, he realized his only way out of jail was to minimize his own involvement and give them someone bigger. Whether or not you buy that framing, the timeline lines up with the broader arrests that same month. Durk was arrested last month, and 5 people associated with Lil Durk's Chicago-based rap collective, Only the Family or OTF, are also accused in the case. Grant was one of those 5. 5 other members of the rap group: Kevon London Grant, Vonnie, David Bryan, Lindsey Brownies, Keith Jones, Flacka, Asa Houston Boogie, and DeAndre Dontrell Wilson Boogie were also arrested. That's the full roster of names, swept up alongside Durk. Not one guy on the outside of the operation. A group, a crew, people who'd built years of history together, suddenly sitting in separate rooms, being asked the same questions about the same night. In 2022, the charge Vonnie eventually pleaded guilty to wasn't small either. He didn't just admit to a minor role. According to reporting from inside the courtroom, Banks' attorney Marissa Goldberg shifted the blame for the murder plot on co-defendant Kevon Grant, the Chicago rapper's personal assistant who pleaded guilty to murder and agreed to cooperate with the government against Durk. Murder, not conspiracy in the abstract sense, an actual guilty plea tied to the killing itself. So by the time the trial opened this August, Vonnie wasn't a mystery witness. He was a known quantity. Everybody in that courtroom and everybody following the case online understood exactly what role he'd played and exactly what he'd admitted to. What they didn't expect was Durk's team using that admission as a weapon, turning Vonnie's own guilty plea into the foundation of an argument that not Durk was the one who orchestrated the whole thing. That's the turn we have to get into next, because for over a year, the public story had been simple. Vonnie snitched on Durk. He flipped, he cooperated. He became the government's star witness. Now Durk's defense is trying to flip that story one more time, and the way they're doing it says a lot about how far both sides are willing to go before this thing reaches a verdict. For a long stretch of 2025, the story around Vonnie was framed. One way and one way only. He was the man who talked. Long before the trial ever started, chatter about his cooperation had already spread through hip-hop media and social platforms, with commentators picking apart every rumor about who was working with the feds and who wasn't. DJ Academics addressed the rumors directly, telling his audience they needed more proof before fully buying into claims that OTF Vonnie might be cooperating against Durk. That caution didn't last long, because the reporting kept stacking up. By the time the case moved toward trial, outlets covering the proceedings were treating Grant's cooperation as settled fact, not rumor. Multiple members of the alleged conspiracy had agreed to cooperate and testify for the prosecution in exchange for leniency, including Durk's associate Casey, OTF Jam, Hester, and Kayvon Vonnie Grant. One detail that mattered here: Vonnie was initially charged in the case, while OTF Jam was not. That distinction matters because it shows Vonnie wasn't just a witness brought in from the outside. He was a defendant who cut a deal, which in the world of federal conspiracy cases usually means he had real exposure, real charges, real years on the table before he agreed to talk. The legal case itself kept growing more complicated the longer it dragged on. Federal reporting described the case as involving approximately 230 gigabytes of digital evidence, such as audio and video recordings and surveillance footage, and approximately 20,000 pages of reports concerning murder and other violent acts, photographs, witness statements, and medical documents. That's not a case built on a single testimony, that's a mountain of material. And prosecutors made clear from the start that cooperating witnesses like Vonnie were meant to be the thread tying all of it together in front of a jury. Then the trial actually got underway, and cooperation stopped being a rumor and became courtroom fact, spoken out loud by prosecutors themselves. The state revealed that OTF Jam, Kayvon Grant, OTF Vonnie, and Keith Jones, Flacca, would be cooperating witnesses for the prosecution, and all three had already pleaded guilty and would be testifying soon. Other outlets covering the opening day confirmed the same lineup. Prosecutors confirmed 3 cooperating witnesses who are expected to testify against him: Casey Hester, known as OTF Jam, Kayvon Grant, known as OTF Vonnie, and Keith Jones, known as Flacca. So going into trial, the public understanding was crystal clear. Vonnie had made his choice. He'd pleaded guilty. He'd agreed to help the government, and everyone assumed his testimony would be the backbone of the case against his former boss. That's the version of the story that had circulated for months. Vonnie, once Durk's right-hand man, now standing on the other side of the courtroom. What nobody fully accounted for was how Durk's own defense would respond to that cooperation, instead of simply trying to discredit Vonnie as a liar looking for a lighter sentence, which is the standard playbook. Goldberg's team went a step further. They didn't just say don't trust him, they said he did it. That's an entirely different legal strategy, and it's a much riskier one. Calling a cooperating witness unreliable is normal defense work. Building an entire opening statement around the idea that the cooperator was actually the ringleader is something else. It's essentially betting the whole case on convincing 12 jurors that the government caught the wrong man's confession and built a prosecution around it. And Goldberg had specific pieces to back that bet up. The credit card story was one piece. The idea that Vonnie had access to the company card, booked the travel, and then told investigators Durk had directed him to do it, when according to the defense, that account was false. The insurance policy line was another piece, the suggestion that Vonnie saw an opportunity in Durk's fame and wealth, a way to trade a smaller name for a much bigger one and walk away with less time. And then there was the emotional piece, the one aimed straight at the jury's gut. Vonnie in the car with Vaughn. Vonnie present when Vaughn died. Vaughn's own alleged words asking why Vonnie let it happen. Put those 3 pieces together, and you get a defense that isn't just fighting the murder-for-hire charge. It's fighting the entire premise that Vonnie's cooperation should be trusted at all. Every version of events Vonnie gave to investigators, every plea agreement he signed, every piece of testimony he was expected to deliver. Durk's team was trying to reframe all of it as the account of a man protecting himself, by pointing at the biggest target in the room. That's the pivot that makes this story different from a typical courtroom cooperation arc. Vonnie didn't just switch sides once, going from OTF insider to government witness. According to the defense, he switched sides in a way that required inventing a story about his old boss to save himself, meaning that in Durk's camp's own telling, Vonnie's whole cooperation was itself a kind of betrayal stacked on top of an earlier one. The one Von's family and fans had wondered about since November 2020. And this is exactly why the framing of Durk's snitching on Vonnie makes sense once you sit with it. Durk's team stood in open court and told the jury who they believe pulled the strings, who was present for a murder, who lied to investigators, and who should be facing the greater share of blame. In a courtroom, naming a co-defendant as the true architect of a crime, while your own client sits quietly at the defense table. Using a witness's own guilty plea and his own words against him is about as direct a form of turning on someone as you can get in a legal setting. Durk wasn't on the stand saying it himself, but his lawyer was doing it for him, on the record with the jury watching. Which brings the story to what actually got said and shown once the evidence started coming in. Because opening statements are one thing. Once the exhibits come out, the surveillance footage, the autopsy photos, the phone records, the story stops being about who said what in an opening and starts being about what the jury actually sees with their own eyes. Once the opening statements wrapped, the trial moved into the part that actually decides these cases, evidence. And the picture that emerged from the first days in court didn't make things simpler. It made the fight between Durk's camp and Vonnie's version of events even sharper. Start with the crime itself. Prosecutors laid out a shooting that happened in broad daylight outside a well-known Los Angeles shopping center. The 2022 plot instead killed Rondo's cousin, Saviaya Lil Pab Robinson, near the Beverly Center in Los Angeles. The intended target survived. Rondo was the intended target of a 2022 shooting in Los Angeles, in which gunfire missed him but killed his cousin, 24-year-old Saviaya Robinson. That miss is the entire reason this became a federal murder-for-hire case instead of something else, because the bullets found the wrong person, and a young woman, with no part in any rap rivalry, ended up dead. Prosecutors made the connection to King Von explicit from their very first words to the jury. Prosecutors alleged the shooting was retaliation for the 2020 killing of King Von. That's the thread that runs through this entire case, a killing in 2020 that supposedly set off a chain that led to another killing in 2022, and now a trial in 2026 trying to sort out who set that chain in motion. The physical evidence presented in the opening days was graphic. As the trial continued, attendees reportedly viewed gruesome footage of Robinson's fatal shooting, and prosecutors additionally presented autopsy photos, revealing the victim's gunshot wounds to her bicep and heart. That's the kind of evidence that doesn't leave much room for abstract argument. A jury watching that footage isn't thinking about credit card records first. They're thinking about a young woman who died because bullets meant for someone else found her instead. But prosecutors didn't rely only on the shooting itself. They built their timeline using Durk's own words. Federal prosecutors have maintained that Lil Durk previously explained, via lyrics, how he wanted the hit on Saviaya Robinson done, pointing to Durk's verse. On Babyface Ray's song Wonderful Wayne and Jackie Boy, where he raps about getting an address, getting a location, and getting the green light. Using an artist's own lyrics as evidence in a murder trial isn't new territory for prosecutors, but it's always a heavy lift for a defense to explain away, because it puts the client's own recorded voice in front of the jury, saying something that sounds like a confession. Then there's the money trail, which is where Vonnie's alleged role becomes unavoidable, no matter which side is telling the story. Prosecutors say money tied to the OTF collective covered flights and lodging, and that a credit card linked to Durk was used. That's the same credit card Goldberg brought up in her opening, the one she says Vonnie used and then falsely claimed was authorized by Durk. Both sides agree the card exists and that it paid for travel connected to the shooting. Where they split is over who was actually giving the orders on the other end of that card. The defense's central move was consistent across every outlet that covered it. Durk was being tried alongside two co-defendants, including his former assistant Kevin Grant, who has accepted a plea deal, and Durk's defense team have pointed to Grant as the one who orchestrated the murder. That's not a one-time line from an opening statement. That's the through line of the entire defense strategy, repeated and reinforced as the trial moved forward. Goldberg herself, addressing the jury directly, said there was no evidence tying her client to the crime. Defense attorney Marissa Goldberg said there is no evidence against her client. Meanwhile, the stakes for Durk personally had been building for over a year before the trial even opened, which explains some of the aggression coming from his defense table. At a bond hearing in December, defense lawyers for Banks offered up a bond secured by $2.3 million in equity in 2 homes in Georgia and $1 million in cash. That offer was rejected. A $4.5 million bond offer was denied, and he's been incarcerated without bail ever since. Durk has spent close to 2 years locked up awaiting this exact moment, watching prosecutors build a case around witnesses who used to be in his inner circle. The 2 other men on trial alongside Durk, DeAndre Wilson and David Lindsay, round out the picture of who prosecutors say actually carried out the shooting, working alongside cooperating witnesses like Jam and Flacca, who admitted to being shooters. Prosecutors said Banks and his 2 co-defendants at trial, DeAndre Wilson and David Lindsay, separately traveled to Los Angeles along with other men involved in the shooting to hunt and kill Quando Rondo, fatally striking Robinson instead. So by the middle of the trial's first week, jurors had been shown surveillance footage of a killing, autopsy photos of the victim, rap lyrics prosecutors say described the plan in advance, and financial records tying travel costs to a credit card connected to Durk. Against all of that, Durk's defense had one consistent counter: that the man who admitted to arranging the travel, who pleaded guilty to murder, and who agreed to testify against his former boss, was actually the one calling the shots the whole time. It's a defense that requires the jury to believe 2 things at once: that Vonnie's guilty plea was real, and that his account of who directed him was not. That's a difficult needle to thread in front of 12 strangers who've just watched footage of a young woman dying from a bullet that wasn't meant for her. And underneath all of that legal maneuvering is the part of the story that never made it into any exhibit or evidence binder: how the people who actually knew both men, who came up in the same scene, who watched King Von die years before any of this trial started, are reacting to watching their history get picked apart in a Los Angeles courtroom. By the time the trial hit its stride, this had stopped being just a courtroom story and turned into something the entire rap world was watching in real time. Day by day, exhibit by exhibit, reaction had actually started building well before the trial itself, going back to the day Durk was first taken into custody. His own father spoke publicly about the arrest, describing the entire situation as something he struggled to process. Lil Durk's father, Dante "Big Durk" Banks, spoke out about his son's arrest, calling it strange. That's a father watching his son go from Grammy-winning artist to federal defendant and having to find words for a situation that made no sense to him from the outside. Other people close to King Von reacted with raw emotion once Durk's arrest became public. Rapper Asian Doll stated that she was ready to crash out about King Von, her late ex-boyfriend, following Lil Durk's arrest in Florida. Her comments split opinion online almost immediately, with some defending her right to grieve, and others accusing her of chasing attention off a tragedy that had already devastated a community once. Old footage resurfaced too, getting re-examined in light of everything that had come out since. An interview from years earlier, where Durk was asked directly about internet chatter, urging him to seek revenge for Von's death, suddenly took on new meaning once the murder-for-hire charges became public. Responding to a question about Slide for Von comments, Lil Durk said, "For some reason, I just don't see them comments no more." Commentators picked that clip apart line by line once the case became national news, with one person online writing that the look on his face says a lot, and pointing others toward that exact moment as the key to understanding everything that followed. That kind of retroactive analysis has followed this case at every stage, and the trial only accelerated it. As soon as the first cooperating witnesses were named in court, commentary channels and hip-hop outlets started dissecting what it meant: that people who'd once been described as Durk's closest circle were now sitting on the other side of the aisle. Content built entirely around Vonnie's cooperation multiplied across platforms, with creators breaking down what his plea meant, what his testimony could look like, and how deep his knowledge of the operation actually ran. The defense's counter-strategy, turning around and calling Vonnie the true architect of the plot, added an entirely new layer to that commentary once opening statements became public. Because now the conversation wasn't just did Vonnie snitch, it became who's telling the truth about who was really in charge, with 2 competing versions of Vonnie circulating at once: the cooperating witness helping put away a rap star, and the alleged mastermind that same rap star's lawyer says orchestrated a murder and then lied his way into a lighter sentence. That double narrative is part of why this case has held so much attention, It's rare for a defense to build its entire opening strategy around discrediting a specific cooperating witness by name, in detail, repeatedly, rather than just generally attacking the credibility of cooperating witnesses as a category. Goldberg didn't do that. She built a story with Vonnie at the center of it, present at Von's death, in control of the murder weapon logistics, using a company credit card to build a false account, and inventing a version of events that let him walk away from the harshest possible charge by handing prosecutors a bigger name. Whether that story holds up is now in the hands of the jury, and it will keep unfolding across the following weeks of testimony, cross-examination, and whatever additional evidence both sides decide to bring forward. The trial was set to resume the following Tuesday, with outlets promising continued updates as proceedings progressed. That means more days of testimony, more moments where Vonnie's own words, spoken from the witness stand under oath, get weighed directly against the version of him that Durk's defense laid out in their opening. That's the part of this case that hasn't happened yet, and it's the part that will decide everything. Vonnie is expected to take the stand as a cooperating witness. When he does, he won't just be answering the prosecution's questions. He'll be doing it under the shadow of an opening statement that already told the jury not to trust a word he says, that painted him as the man who let his best friend bleed out in a back seat, who armed and organized a hit squad, and who then walked into a federal building and handed investigators a story with someone else's name at the top of it. For Durk, the strategy is a gamble with everything on the table. Investigators believe he targeted rapper Quando Rondo in a plot that investigators believe was retaliation for the earlier murder of Chicago OTF rapper King Von. If jurors believe the government's version, built on lyrics, financial records, surveillance footage, and testimony from 3 men who once stood beside him, Durk faces the possibility of spending the rest of his life behind bars. If jurors believe his defense instead, the story that gets written into the public record is one where Vonnie, the childhood friend who rode with Von to the hospital and later worked at Durk's side for years, becomes the man history remembers as the one who turned a tragedy into a murder plot and then lied about who was really behind it. Either way, this trial has already done something no headline or online rumor managed to do on its own. It's put both stories in the same room, under oath, in front of the same 12 people, and forced them to answer for every version of events that's circulated since the moment Von died back in November 2020. Vonnie built his cooperation on the promise that telling the truth about Durk would earn him a lighter sentence.